6 months had transformed the small settlement on Hana from a collection of temporary structures into something that felt almost like home. The garden world lived up to its name, with rolling hills covered in purple grass and forests of trees that sang when the wind moved through their crystalline leaves. Mireille stood on the porch of the house that she and Xiang had built together, watching the twin suns begin their slow descent toward the horizon. Her body had changed dramatically as the pregnancy progressed, her normally slender frame now heavy with the child who would arrive within days, according to the medical scans. The journey to this moment had been neither simple nor easy. She and Xiang had struggled to define what they were to each other. Two people bound together by impossible circumstances rather than choice. They were not romantic partners in the way that humans typically understood the term. Yet they had become something deeper and more fundamental. They were allies who had faced exile and judgment together. Friends who had learned to understand each other across the vast gulf between their species. They were parents preparing to welcome a child who would belong fully to neither of their peoples, and yet somehow to both. Xiang emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of the tea that Mireille had grown to love during her time among humans. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he settled into the chair beside her. Large. She replied with a smile that still felt strange on her face, but no longer impossible. Uncomfortable and anxious and somehow happy at the same time. He laughed, a sound that she had come to associate with warmth and safety in the months since the tribunal. "That sounds about right for this stage," he said. "My mother used to say that the last weeks before birth are the longest weeks of your life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the suns paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that no Valorian world could match. Mireille had learned to appreciate these quiet moments, so different from the rigid schedules and purposeful activity that had defined her previous existence. Living among humans had taught her that not every moment needed to be productive, that sometimes the greatest value came from simply being present with the people you cared about. A chime from inside the house announced an incoming communication, and Xiang went to answer it while Mireille remained on the porch. She heard his voice rise in surprise and then excitement, and moments later he returned with an expression that made her heart race. "We have visitors arriving tomorrow," he announced. "Captain Park is bringing someone who wants to meet you." The next morning brought the familiar sight of Captain Park's battered freighter descending through the atmosphere, its engines coughing and sputtering in a way that somehow always sounded friendly to Mireille's ears. But the person who emerged from the ship behind the old captain was not friendly at all. She was young by Valorian standards, perhaps 80 years old, with the pale skin and bioluminescent markings that identified her as a member of one of the minor houses. Her name was Sora, and she had traveled across the galaxy in secret to find Mireille. "I had to come," Sora explained as they sat together in the modest living room of the house. "When word of your exile spread through Valoria, many of us felt something we had never experienced before." "What did you feel?" Mireille asked gently. "Hope," Sora replied, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking the word too loudly might shatter something precious. "Hope that there might be another way to live. Hope that the Council's control is not as absolute as they want us to believe." She explained that a small but growing movement had emerged among the younger Valorians, individuals who questioned the traditions that had governed their society for thousands of years. They had watched the tribunal broadcast across the galaxy, had heard Mireille's words about choice and freedom and family, and something had awakened in them that the Council had worked for generations to suppress. "We call ourselves the Seekers," Sora said, "and we believe that you have shown us a path that we never knew existed." Mireille felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened, overwhelmed by the idea that her desperate flight for survival might have ignited something larger than herself. "I did not intend to become a symbol," she said softly. "The best symbols never do." Captain Park interjected from his seat by the window. "They just follow their hearts and let others find meaning in their courage." 2 days later, Myri went into labor. The birth was neither quick nor easy, her hybrid physiology presenting challenges that required all of Xiao's medical expertise to navigate. But when the crying finally filled the small room and Xiang placed the infant in her arms, Myri understood at last why humans considered children sacred. Her daughter was perfect. She had her mother's bioluminescent markings, but they glowed with a warm golden light rather than the cool blue of pure-blooded Valorians. Her eyes held the shape and color of her father's, deep brown pools that already seemed to hold more wisdom than any newborn should possess. They named her Hanyul, a Korean word that meant sky, because she was born under the endless sky of a garden world far from the civilizations that had tried to prevent her existence. News of the birth spread across the galaxy within days, carried by traders and diplomats and the growing network of seekers who had made Murray's story their own. Some species reacted with fear, seeing the hybrid child as a threat to the purity they prized above all else. Others responded with wonder, recognizing in Hanyul the fulfillment of a promise that the precursors had made millions of years before deep in unexplored space. Sensors detected an energy surge from a derelict station that had drifted silent and cold for millennia. The precursor artifact had awakened again, its ancient mechanisms stirring to life as it searched for new candidates to bridge the gaps between distant peoples. The project continued, as it always had, patient and purposeful beyond the understanding of any single civilization on Hana. Myre sat in the garden behind her house, watching Xiang teach their daughter to walk among the purple grass. Hanyul's first steps were unsteady, her small legs struggling to support her weight. But she pressed forward with a determination that made both her parents laugh with joy. She pressed forward with a determination that made both her parents laugh with joy. Bioluminescent markings on her skin flickered and pulsed with every step. A light show that seemed to celebrate each small victory. A message had arrived that morning from Sora, reporting that the Seekers had grown to number in the thousands and that the Council was growing concerned. Change was coming to Valorian society. Slow and uncertain, but inevitable. Myre did not know what the future would hold for her daughter or for the galaxy that had been forever altered by her impossible existence. But watching Hanyul take another step and then another, her golden light bright against the purple grass, Myre knew one thing with absolute certainty. Family was not determined by blood or genetics or council decree. Family was what you chose to create and what you were willing to fight for, and humanity had taught her to fight. Now she would spend the rest of her life teaching her daughter the same lesson. The Galactic Concord Station hung in the void between star systems like a jewel suspended in infinite darkness. Its massive structure, home to representatives from every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, Murray had never imagined she would stand in these halls as a defendant rather than a diplomat, facing judgment for the crime of carrying life within her body. The tribunal chamber was vast and circular, with tiered seating rising toward a domed ceiling that displayed a slowly rotating view of the surrounding stars. Representatives from dozens of species filled the seats, their expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt as they watched her enter. The Valorian Council delegation occupied a prominent position near the front, their faces cold and impassive in the manner she had been trained since childhood to emulate. High Counselor Tyan led their group, her silver hair arranged in the elaborate style that indicated her ancient lineage, and her eyes sharp with intelligence and disdain. Dr. Xiong walked beside Myre, his presence a comfort that she clung to amid the overwhelming formality of the proceedings. A human legal advocate named Jie Moon had agreed to represent them, a small woman with fierce eyes who had spent decades fighting for the rights of those caught between species and their conflicting laws. The Council of Valoria brings formal charges against the individual known as Mireille of House Valen. High Councilor Tian announced when the tribunal came to order. She stands accused of unauthorized reproduction in violation of the genetic purity statutes, of fleeing Valorian jurisdiction to avoid lawful correction procedures, and of contaminating the Valorian bloodline with alien genetic material. The words fell upon the chamber like stones dropped into still water, and Mireille felt the weight of every eye upon her. We demand that this tribunal recognize Valorian jurisdiction over this matter and return the accused to our custody for appropriate treatment. Advocate Moon rose to her feet, her small frame somehow commanding attention throughout the vast chamber. The Galactic Concord exists to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their species of origin, she declared in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room. My client carries a child with human genetic heritage, which grants the child rights under human law that cannot be superseded by Valorian tradition. The debate that followed was long and complex, with representatives from various species offering opinions and precedents and arguments that seemed to have no end. Some supported the Valorian position, arguing that species must be allowed to govern their own internal affairs without outside interference. Others sided with the humans, insisting that the rights of the unborn child must be considered regardless of the circumstances of its conception. Through it all, Mireille sat in silence, feeling the future of her child being decided by beings who had never met her and never would. During a recess in the proceedings, Advocate Moon approached with news that shifted everything. We have obtained records from the Precursor Archive that are relevant to your case, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. The artifact that affected you and Dr. Xiong has activated twice before in recorded galactic history. She explained that the Precursors had designed these artifacts specifically to create bridges between incompatible species at crucial moments in galactic development. The hybrids that resulted had gone on to become pivotal figures in their respective eras, forging alliances and understanding between civilizations that have been destined for conflict. Your child is not an accident or a contamination, Advocate Moon concluded. Your child is the continuation of a project that began millions of years ago, designed to unite the galaxy rather than divide it. When the tribunal reconvened, the advocate presented this evidence to gasps of surprise and murmurs of wonder from the assembled representatives. High Councilor Tian's expression grew increasingly rigid as the implications of the Precursor records became clear. This changes nothing, she declared when the advocate finished. Valorian law does not recognize the intentions of extinct alien species as valid justification for genetic violation. Your traditions are not older than the stars themselves. A deep voice rumbled from the back of the chamber, and Mireille turned to see an ancient being of a species she did not recognize. I am Curator Baiko of the Precursor Archive, the being announced, and I can confirm that the records presented here are authentic. The Precursors understood something that many younger species have forgotten. Curator Baiko continued, that life finds ways to connect across any barrier, and that those connections are precious beyond measure. High Councilor Tian's composure finally cracked, her voice sharp with frustration. We are not here to debate philosophy, she snapped. We are here to enforce the law. And then Mireille did something she had never done in her 2 centuries of existence. She stood without permission and spoke without being recognized, breaking every protocol she had ever been taught. You want to enforce the law, she said, her voice trembling but clear. But whose law and for what purpose? The chamber fell silent as all attention focused on her. I have spent my entire life following Valorian law, Mireille continued. I have suppressed my emotions and denied my desires and served the council without question. But in the weeks since I left my ship and traveled among other species, I have learned something that my people have forgotten. I learned that chaos is not the same as weakness. That emotion is not the same as irrationality. That love is not something to be controlled and rationed by committees. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the warmth of the life growing within her. The humans took me in when I was a stranger and a fugitive, she said. They protected me when they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. They taught me that family is not determined by genetics or approved by councils. That family is what you choose to create and what you are willing to fight for. Tears streamed down her face now, but she did not try to hide them. I choose this child, she declared. I choose Dr. Siong as my partner in raising this child. I choose humanity as my people. She turned to face the Valorian delegation directly, and I renounce my citizenship, my house, and my standing among the Valorians. High Counselor Tyan's face had gone pale, and for the first time, Myray saw something other than cold calculation in her eyes. You do not know what you are saying, the counselor said quietly. Exile is permanent and irreversible. I know exactly what I am saying, Myray replied. I am saying that I would rather be free among strangers than imprisoned among my own kind. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives shouted and argued and debated the unprecedented events unfolding before them. When order was finally restored, the tribunal rendered its judgment. Moray's renunciation of Valorian citizenship was recognized under galactic law, which meant she was no longer subject to Valorian jurisdiction. The child she carried was granted protected status as a hybrid of significant historical importance. The Valorian Council was ordered to withdraw its charges and cease all pursuit of the defendant. High Counselor Tyan's final words to Myra were delivered in the ancient Valorian dialect that few still understood. You have become the first exile in 400 years, she said with a mixture of contempt and something that might have been grudging respect. May you find whatever it is you were looking for among your new people. As Myra walked out of the tribunal chamber with Siong beside her, she felt the weight of centuries lifting from her shoulders. She had lost everything she had ever known. But looking at the human who had chosen to stand with her, she realized that she had also gained something infinitely more precious. She had gained the freedom to choose her own path, and she had found a family worth fighting for. The Valorian enforcement vessel gained on them with every passing minute. Its superior engines, designed specifically for pursuit, cutting through the void like a blade. Captain Park pushed his old freighter to its limits, coaxing every bit of speed from engines that groaned in protest at the demands being placed upon them. We cannot outrun them, he admitted through gritted teeth. But we might be able to lose them if we reach Ashfall before they catch us. Ashfall was one of the boundary worlds, a planet scarred by decades of conflict between rival alien factions fighting over resources and territory, the atmospheric interference from the endless fires and ash clouds would make sensor tracking nearly impossible, giving them a chance to disappear. Myra watched the distance between the ships shrinking on the display and calculated that they would reach the planet with perhaps minutes to spare. The descent through Ashfall's atmosphere was violent and terrifying, the freighter shaking and bucking as it plunged through layers of smoke and turbulent air currents. Captain Park landed in a valley between two mountain ranges where the ruins of a former city provided cover from orbital observation. The medical relief teams operate out of a 5 camp about 20 kilometers east of here, he said as the engines powered down. Your Dr. Siong should be there if he is anywhere on this world. Myra thanked him with a traditional Valorian gesture of gratitude, pressing her palm to her chest and bowing her head. You have done more for me than I can repay, she said. her voice thick with emotion that she would never have expressed among her own people. Captain Park waved away her thanks with a dismissive hand. "Find your human," he said with a knowing smile. "Tell him about the child and trust him to do the right thing." The journey across the war-torn landscape of Ashfall took Mireille through scenes of devastation that made her heart ache. Burned villages and abandoned farms dotted the hillsides, their former inhabitants either dead or scattered to refugee camps across the region. She encountered survivors along the way, aliens of various species who looked at her with suspicion until they realized she meant no harm. One elderly creature with 4 arms and skin, like bark, pointed her toward the human medical camp, explaining that the humans had set up their facilities in a valley that both warring factions had agreed to leave alone. "They heal anyone who comes to them," the creature said with wonder in its voice. "They do not ask which side you fight for or what you have done. They simply help." Mireille found this difficult to comprehend, given the strict protocols that govern Valorian medical assistance and the careful screening required before treatment was provided. But as she approached the camp and saw the humans working tirelessly among the wounded and sick, she began to understand what Captain Park had meant about his species. Rows of medical tents stretched across the valley floor, each one filled with patients receiving care regardless of their species or background. Human doctors and nurses moved between the beds with efficiency and compassion, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but their hands steady and sure. And there among them, directing a team of assistants in the treatment of a badly burned patient, stood Dr. Eunice Young. He looked thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But when he turned and saw her standing at the entrance to the tent, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something more complex that she could not identify. "Mireille." He said her name like a question, stepping away from his work and walking toward her with hesitant steps. "How are you here? Why are you here? What happened to you?" The questions tumbled from his mouth in rapid succession, and Mireille felt tears forming in her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Something impossible happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I needed to find you." They walked to a quiet area at the edge of the camp where they could speak privately, and Mireille told him everything. She described the medical scan and its impossible results, the artifact and the moment when they had touched it together. The council and forces who were hunting her across the galaxy. Xiong listened in silence, his face cycling through shock and denial and anger and confusion as the full weight of her words settled upon him. "This is not possible," he said when she finished, his scientific mind rejecting the evidence even as his heart told him otherwise. "Human and Valorian biology are completely incompatible. We learned that decades ago when our species first made contact." Mireille nodded, understanding his resistance because she had felt the same way. "The artifact changed something in both of us," she said. "I have been researching during my journey, and I found records of the precursor civilization that built that station." She told him about the ancient species that had seeded life across the galaxy millions of years ago, about their experiments in bridging the gaps between different forms of life. The artifact had been designed to select compatible individuals from incompatible species and modify them at a genetic level. They were not the first to experience this phenomenon, but the records were sparse and the previous instances had occurred so long ago that they had passed into legend. "So we were chosen," Xiong said slowly, struggling to accept what she was telling him, "by a machine built by beings who have been dead for millions of years." "Yes," Mireille confirmed. "And now I am pregnant with a child who should not exist, hunted by my own people. And I had nowhere else to go." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and uncertain futures. When Xiong finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, that he did not try to hide. "I did not ask for this," he said. "I did not consent to becoming part of some ancient experiment." "Neither did I," Murray replied, feeling her heart sink at his words. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. "But I cannot abandon a child," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Whatever else I might feel about this situation, that is something I am simply incapable of doing." A commotion at the camp entrance interrupted them, and they turned to see a squad of Valorian enforcers marching toward the medical tents. "Murray of House Valen," the squad leader announced in a voice that carried across the valley. "You are charged with unauthorized reproduction and genetic contamination. You will submit to council authority and return with us immediately." Fear gripped Murray's heart, but before she could respond, Xiang stepped forward to stand beside her. "This woman is under the protection of the Human Medical Corps," he declared, his voice steady and clear. "Under the terms of the Interspecies Medical Convention, she has claimed refugee status and cannot be removed without a full hearing before the Galactic Concord." The Valorian squad leader's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened with anger. "This is an internal Valorian matter," she said coldly. "Humans have no standing to interfere." But Xiang held his ground, and around them, other humans began to gather, their faces grim and determined. "She carries a child with human genetic material," Xiang replied. "That makes this a human matter as well." The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut, and Murray realized that she was witnessing something she had never seen before. Humans protecting someone who was not their own, simply because it was the right thing to do. The squad leader's eyes narrowed as she calculated the political implications of forcing the issue. "This is not over," she said finally. Stepping back, "The council will petition the Galactic Concord for jurisdiction, and when they grant it, we will return." As the enforcers departed, Murray turned to Xiang with gratitude overwhelming her ability to speak. "Thank you," she finally managed. "You did not have to do that." Xiang gave her a small smile that did not quite reach his exhausted eyes. "Yes, I did," he said simply. "That is what humans do." New Bizon rose from the surface of the colony world like a monument to human ambition, its towers reaching toward the sky in defiance of the harsh winds that swept across the plains. Murray guided her battered shuttle through the crowded traffic lanes above the city, marveling at the chaos that seemed to govern human civilization. Ships of every size and configuration darted between the towers, their pilots shouting at each other through open communication channels, their vessels coming within meters of collision before veering away at the last moment. No Valorian settlement would ever tolerate such disorder, such inefficiency, such reckless disregard for proper protocols and procedures. Yet somehow it worked. Somehow the humans navigated through the madness and reached their destinations. Somehow the city functioned despite appearing to exist on the edge of constant disaster. She landed at the public port and stepped out into an assault on her senses that nearly drove her back. Into the shuttle, the noise hit her first. A wall of sound composed of voices and machinery and music and countless other sources that her mind could not separate or identify. Then came the emotions, washing over her empathic abilities like a tidal wave that threatened to drown her beneath its weight. Humans broadcast their feelings with an intensity that no other species could match, and being surrounded by thousands of them at once felt like standing in the center of a storm. Murray forced herself to move forward, constructing mental barriers that dampened the empathic input to manageable levels, and made her way toward the Transit Authority office. The official behind the counter was a middle-aged human woman with tired eyes and a kind smile who listened patiently to her inquiry. Dr. Xiang departed 3 days ago on the relief ship Compassion's journey, the woman explained while consulting her terminal. They are heading toward the boundary worlds to provide medical assistance in the conflict zones. Mireille felt her hope deflate like a punctured balloon, the weight of her situation pressing down on her shoulders once more. Is there any way to contact the ship or to book passage on a vessel traveling the same route? She asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. The woman shook her head with genuine sympathy, explaining that communication with ships in the boundary worlds was unreliable at best and that civilian travel to the conflict zones had been restricted. Mireille thanked her and walked out into the crowded streets, her mind racing to find another solution. She wandered through the market district without any destination, observing the humans as they went about their daily lives with an energy that seemed inexhaustible. Families walked together with children running ahead and parents calling after them with voices full of exasperated love. Merchants haggled with customers in animated exchanges that looked like arguments but ended with laughter and handshakes. Couples held hands and whispered to each other, their emotions radiating warmth that Mireille could feel even through her mental shields. These were the beings that the Valorians considered primitive and short-lived and unworthy of serious attention. Yet watching them now, Mireille saw something that her people had lost, somewhere in their long history of careful evolution and emotional suppression. She saw life being lived fully and passionately, without calculation or restraint, without fear of judgment or concern for propriety. A commotion near the port entrance drew her attention, and she saw two Valorians in diplomatic uniforms scanning the crowd with obvious purpose. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the insignia of the Council's Enforcement Division on their collars. They had found her faster than she had anticipated, which meant that someone had flagged her shuttle's registration when she landed. Mireille ducked into a narrow alley between two food stalls, pressing herself against the wall as she tried to control her racing heart. You look like you need to be somewhere else very quickly, a voice said from behind her, and she spun around to find a human man watching her with knowing eyes. He was old by human standards, with gray hair and deep wrinkles that spoke of decades spent working in harsh conditions. My name is Do-Yoon Park, he continued, keeping his voice low. I used to captain a freight hauler before I retired, and I know what it looks like when someone is running from authority. Mireille hesitated, her training warning her against trusting strangers. But the sound of Valorian voices growing closer forced her to make a quick decision. I need to reach the boundary worlds, she said. Can you help me? Captain Park studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Before nodding slowly, my old ship is docked in the private hangar on the south side, he said. She is not fast and she is not pretty, but she will get you where you need to go. They moved through the back streets of New Bizen, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the Valorian enforcers were conducting their search. Captain Park walked with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of this city, leading her through doors and passages that seemed invisible to casual observers. Why are you helping me? Mireille asked as they approached the hangar where his ship waited. You do not know me or my situation. The old captain smiled, the expression that transformed his stern face into something almost gentle. Because I have been where you are, he replied, running from people who think they have the right to control your life, looking for something worth fighting for. His ship was exactly as he had described, an aging freight hauler that showed the wear of countless journeys across the stars. But as they lifted off and left New Bizen behind, Mireille felt something she had not experienced since leaving the Harmonies. Grace. She felt hope during the long journey toward the boundary worlds. Captain Park shared stories about his life among the humans, about the family he had raised and lost and found again. He spoke about human concepts of loyalty and love that extended beyond blood and genetics, about the bonds that people chose to create rather than those that were assigned to them. among my people. Family is something you are born into, Myre said during one of their conversations. It is determined by the Council based on genetic optimization and social utility. Captain Park laughed, a sound that rumbled through the small bridge like friendly thunder. That sounds very efficient and very lonely, he said without judgment. Humans believe that family is what you make it, that the people you choose to love are more important than the people you are required to love. Myre placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the warmth that had become familiar to her now. What about children? She asked quietly. What do humans believe about children? The old captain's expression softened, and she felt a wave of emotion from him that was fierce and tender at the same time. Children are sacred to us, he said simply. We protect them with everything we have. We sacrifice for them without hesitation. We love them beyond reason or logic. A proximity alarm interrupted their conversation, and Captain Park's face grew serious as he checked his instruments. We have company, he announced, his fingers dancing across the controls with surprising speed. A Valorian enforcement vessel just dropped out of hyperspace behind us. Myre felt fear grip her hard as she watched the approaching ship on the display. They had found her again, and this time there was nowhere to hide. The medical scanner hummed with a soft blue light as Myre lay perfectly still on the examination table, her bioluminescent markings pulsing gently beneath. Her pale skin in rhythm with her heartbeat. She had felt strange for weeks now. A persistent nausea that no medication could ease, a fatigue that sleep could not cure, and a growing warmth in her abdomen that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The Valorian medical AI processed her biological data with cold efficiency, its holographic display flickering through countless readings and measurements that meant nothing to her anxious mind. Diagnosis complete, the AI announced in its emotionless voice, and Myre felt her throat tighten with anticipation. Subject displays elevated hormone levels consistent with early-stage pregnancy. Estimated gestational period of 11 weeks. Genetic analysis indicates hybrid composition with markers from an unregistered species. Myre sat up so quickly that her head spun, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. That is impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sterile medical bay. Valorians can only reproduce with partners approved by the Council. Partners whose genetic compatibility has been verified through centuries of careful study. The AI remained silent, offering no comfort and no explanation, simply displaying the undeniable evidence on its holographic screen. Myre stared at the data, her mind racing backward through time to find an answer that made sense. And then she remembered the expedition 3 months ago. The research vessel, Harmony's Grace, had been investigating an ancient station drifting at the edge of known space. A relic from the precursor civilization that had vanished millions of years before any current species had evolved. She had been part of the scientific team, working alongside researchers from a dozen different worlds, including the humans who had recently joined the Galactic community. Dr. Yuna Siong had been assigned as her partner for the expedition, a human xenobiologist with kind eyes and an easy smile, who never seemed intimidated by her people's reputation for emotional coldness. They had discovered a chamber deep within the station, a room filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with an energy that their instruments could not identify or measure. When they had touched the central crystal together, reaching for it at the same moment with scientific curiosity overriding caution, the room had exploded with light. Myre remembered the sensation of warmth flooding through her body, remembered the feeling of her consciousness expanding to touch something vast and ancient and purposeful. She remembered looking at Siong and seeing him, surrounded by golden light, his expression one of wonder and confusion that must have mirrored her own. The medical team had examined them both afterward and found nothing wrong, declaring the incident a minor energy discharge with no lasting effects. But something had changed between them after that day. A connection that Mireille could not explain and had tried very hard to ignore. She had found herself seeking his company during meals, engaging him in conversations that lasted long into the night cycle, and feeling a strange emptiness whenever his duties took him to other parts of the ship, when he had been reassigned 2 weeks ago to a human colony vessel heading toward the frontier. She had told herself that the hollow feeling in her chest meant nothing. Now she understood that the artifact had done something to them, something that transcended the biological barriers between their species. The child growing inside her carried his genetic material, impossible as that should have been, and she had no idea how to process this information. Mireille pressed her palm against her stomach, feeling the warmth that now made terrible sense, and realized that she had very little time before her condition became obvious. Valorian society operated on strict principles of genetic purity and council-approved reproduction, and an unauthorized pregnancy would be considered a crime of the highest order. Discovery would mean exile at best and forced termination at worst, followed by genetic correction procedures that would strip away whatever the artifact had changed within her. She could not allow that to happen. Though she could not yet explain why she felt so certain about protecting this impossible life, the AI interrupted her thoughts with another announcement, informing her that her medical records had been automatically uploaded to the central database for routine review. Mireille felt panic surge through her veins as she realized that she had, perhaps hours before, someone in authority noticed the anomaly in her file. She needed to find Sion, needed to understand what had happened to them, and needed to make decisions about a future that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. Moving with purpose she had not felt in years, Mireille erased her medical records from the local system and disabled the AI's communication functions. She gathered her personal belongings from her quarters, taking only what she could carry easily, and made her way to the shuttle bay with her heart pounding against her ribs. The night shift meant fewer crew members in the corridors, and those she passed showed no suspicion toward a senior scientist walking with apparent calm through familiar hallways. She chose the smallest shuttle in the bay, a short-range vessel meant for planetary surveys that would not be missed immediately. Her hands trembled as she initiated the launch sequence, half expecting alarms to blare and security forces to come rushing through the doors. But the bay remained quiet. The ship continued its orbit around the trade station, and the shuttle slipped free into the darkness of space without incident. Mireille set her course for the last known position of the human colony vessel, calculating that she could intercept their route if she pushed the shuttle's engines beyond recommended limits. As the stars stretched into lines around her and the jump drive engaged, she allowed herself one moment to feel the enormity of what she had done. She had abandoned her position, her people, and her entire way of life for a human she barely knew and a child that should not exist. The Valorians would come looking for her, would brand her a criminal and a genetic deviant, would strip away every honor she had earned in her 200 years of faithful service. But as she placed her hand on her stomach once more and felt that inexplicable warmth, Mireille knew that she could not have made any other choice. Somewhere ahead of her, traveling toward the frontier without any knowledge of what had happened, Dr. Unision was living his ordinary human life. She would find him, would make him understand, and together they would face whatever consequences the galaxy chose to impose. The shuttle hurtled through hyperspace, carrying her toward an uncertain future, and Mireille closed her eyes and let herself imagine what it might feel like to be free.